Hey there! In this video, I'm going to be comparing the Sigma 24-70 DG DN for E-mount with the Sony 24-70 G Mark II. Now, I've owned the G Mark II since it came out, and it pretty much lives on my FX3. And before that, I owned the G Mark I. Now, I've used the Sigma lens, which is what I'm shooting on right now. I've used it before, and I have a lot of friends that own it and use it and love it. And I'm really curious how it stacks up against the G Mark II because it's half the price. So if you're interested in trying to figure out which lens you might want to buy, or maybe if you own the G Mark II, if you're thinking maybe I should sell this and save some money, well, that's what we're going to get into in this video. So I want to jump right into it and talk about image quality, see if we can figure out where are some of the differences between these two lenses. So I did a few examples outside to take a look and compare these two. And so for these examples, I shot them in S-Log3 on the FX3 and then just used Sony's technical conversion LUT to convert it to Rec. 709. I didn't do any color adjustments in post, so you can really see the differences between the two lenses. So right off the bat, you can probably see that the image quality is very similar between these two lenses. I think they produce very similar amounts of contrast. There's a slight difference in the colors, which we'll look at more closely later, but essentially the Sigma is just a little bit warmer, and this can definitely be corrected in post, but there is a difference in the colors. I'd definitely say that the Sony is a little bit sharper, but just a little bit. Now, taking a look at the bokeh, I would say overall they look very similar on the two lenses. Both are pretty smooth and easy and pretty pleasant. I don't really have a preference there. But overall, I have to say I have a slight preference to the Sigma in terms of its overall rendering and its colors. But that's just a subjective thing and a personal preference. You can't go wrong with either lens in terms of image quality. I think they both produce a really similar image. Like I said, in terms of contrast, the Sigma is just a little bit warmer and the Sony is just a little bit sharper. So let's go into the computer and take a look and see where the color differences are. So we're inside the computer here, and I want to briefly show you the differences of the colors between the two lenses. So the way I like to do this is by shooting a color chart and then taking a look at the vector scope. So the color chart here, all the colors in the first column correspond with the colors on the vector scope. And so this over here is, on the left-hand side is the Sony lens, and on the right is the Sigma. And so both are, the reason why you see two sets of lines over here is because we're looking at both color charts at the same time. So let me turn the Sigma off. So this is the Sony lens, and it looks pretty accurate. And what I mean by that is each of these colors are aiming at the boxes pretty well. So if they were shifted off one direction, they wouldn't be as accurate. And how far they stick out is how saturated each of those colors are. So you can see they look pretty accurate. And then when I bring the Sigma lens back in here, you can see that the colors are a little bit shifted over to the warmer side, so closer to the red and yellow side. So, and the green is shifted over too. So again, if we turn this off, this is the Sony, that's the Sigma. So you can see it's shifted warmer, which is definitely what we noticed when we were shooting it outside. You can also see some smaller differences here, like if you look at the green, it's a little bit more accurate on the Sony lens, a little bit more saturated. You can definitely see that here with the green color chips going on. So really interesting here, but it's a very small shift and it's pretty easy to correct, but you can definitely see that with the color charts. Next, let's talk about distortion and in-camera lens corrections. So one thing I was concerned about with the Sigma lens is the ability of the Sony cameras, specifically in my case, the FX3, and how it handles the in-camera lens corrections. So if you don't know this, a lot of these lenses have flaws in terms of distortion or vignetting, chromatic aberration, and the camera will take care of this and put those fixes into the image, both for photo and video. Now, for photo, if you shoot raw, you can apply them in post pretty easily, but for video, it's a little bit trickier. So I really like to have the in-camera lens corrections turned on for shooting video, because I said it's a little bit harder to correct them. And you won't usually turn these on and then you don't think about it unless you're shooting raw video, like externally on the FX3, and then you'll see them come through because it doesn't apply these corrections. So I was curious about if they worked and how well they worked. So the ones that are in the FX3, for example, are gonna be the shading correction, which is vignetting, chromatic aberration, and distortion. And all of these actually work, and I'm going to show you them in practice here. One thing that doesn't work, of course, is the focus breathing compensation, but this is pretty much expected because it only works with Sony lenses and specific Sony lenses. So we'll take a look at the corrections turned off and then see how well they work and compare them between the Sigma and the Sony. So first of all, take a look at the Sigma lens. This is with no corrections turned on, and you can see there's quite a bit of distortion going on here. So once we turn on the distortion correction, you can see it cleans it up pretty well. And then lastly, we turn the other two corrections on, the shading and chromatic aberration. I think overall it produces a pretty clean image. So taking a look at the Sony, you can see this is with no corrections turned on. There's a lot of distortion going on and some vignetting. This is with the distortion correction turned on. You can see it definitely straightens out the image pretty well. And then lastly, with all corrections turned on except for focus breathing. You can see you get a really clean image. So they seem to both work really well on both the Sigma and the Sony. Of course, I expect it to work really well on the Sony, but let's compare them really quickly. So taking a look at the Sigma against the Sony, this is no corrections. And then lastly, with all of the corrections turned on other than focus breathing, you can see that the camera does a pretty good job about correcting these things on both lenses. So overall, I would say the Sigma does a really good job, and it's really cool to see Sony supporting corrections with a third-party lens. Next, let's talk about the autofocus. And anytime that you're testing out or thinking about using a third-party lens, you're gonna assume that the first-party lens, or the Sony lens in this case, is gonna perform a little bit better just because it's first-party and not third-party. So testing this out, I used the FX3 with face and eye autofocus enabled, just a basic test of me walking towards the camera and moving around a little bit. I would say that they perform very similarly. I'd say the Sony is just maybe a little bit faster here, but the Sigma is definitely usable and I think could be trusted in most situations here. So just a slight advantage to the Sony, as you'd expect with a brand new G Master lens, but Sigma performed pretty well. Next, on to focus breathing, and this is actually pretty well controlled on the Sigma lens. It's not terrible. And again, this does not have focus breathing compensation for the Sigma lens. Now the Sony has the focus breathing compensation, and this is what it looks like. And of course, there is no focus breathing once you put that in, but you do have to give up a little bit of a crop. So overall here, Sigma does pretty well, but if you want to have zero focus breathing, you need to have this G Master to enable the focus breathing compensation inside the camera. In terms of flaring, the Sigma has some veiling and ghosting flares, but it's pretty well controlled and it maintains contrast pretty well. The Sony also has some veiling and ghosting flares. It's similar in terms of the veiling flare and slightly less ghosting flare, but both lenses hold contrast pretty well and perform pretty well in terms of keeping the flares under control. In terms of close focusing, it's kind of a wash here. The Sigma goes from 0.59 to 1.25 feet, and the Sony from 0.69 to 0.99 feet. So similar with benefits at 24 or 74 each lens. Next, let's talk about the design and features of these two lenses. So they both have 82mm filter threads, and in terms of their size, they're pretty similar, with the Sony maybe being just a little bit shorter than the Sigma, but not much of a difference there. One thing I want to point out here is that they zoom opposite from each other, as you can see with the numbers here. So when I extend this out to 70, and I extend the Sony out to 70, here's what they look like extended. Again, with the Sony being maybe slightly shorter than the Sigma, but not too much of a difference there. One other thing I want to point out here about their focus rings, and that they both have a very similar feel to them. The Sigma is a little bit wider and easier to grab. And another thing I want to mention is about the focus throw. So if you are in manual focus, the Sigma definitely has a much longer focus throw, which makes it a lot easier to focus. Of course, these are both focus by wire lenses, but it's something to consider. They're both dust and moisture resistant. They're not fully weather sealed, I guess, but whatever that means, I don't like to test those things out. And one thing I do want to point out about the Sigma is that when this lens first came on the market, it had some issues with dust getting inside. But I guess they fixed it, and all of the copies that have come out in the last few years have been, that issue's been fixed. So if you're looking for an older lens, just make sure it doesn't have any dust issues. But if you're buying a new one now, you shouldn't have an issue with that. One of the big differences between these two lenses is the weight. So the Sony is 1.5 pounds and the Sigma is 1.84 pounds. So about 1/3 of a pound difference, which can be actually pretty huge if you're carrying the lens around all day, or if you're having it on a gimbal like I often do. So you definitely want to keep that in mind. So let me show you some of the features on both of these lenses. So starting with the Sigma here, it doesn't have as many features as the Sony, but I think it has just what you need. So let me show you around a little bit. We have a very satisfying and very clicky autofocus to manual focus switch, which I like. It also has a customizable button here. And then you have a lock to keep it from opening up if you're carrying it around, but as soon as you turn the zoom, it unclicks it, so that's really nice. And that's just about it. It's a very simple lens, but overall, I like the build quality a little bit better on the Sigma. It feels like it's more made out of metal than plastic, but it also is a little bit heavier. So taking a look now at the Sony lens. So this has a few more features that I want to show you. It does have 2 customizable buttons, which is handy if you're shooting portrait or landscape. It has an autofocus manual focus switch, and it also has this smooth to tight control. And what this does is this controls the zoom. So this is the smooth. It is very easy to control, and you can change this to tight, which makes it a lot stiffer, which I've never actually thought that I needed to adjust that on a lens, but I usually leave it on the tight when it's on a gimbal so that it's not moving around. but it doesn't really move around too much even in the smooth setting, but you do have that option there. The next thing is you have the aperture control, which is something that I actually don't use on these lenses, but it is a feature that I do want to mention here. So first of all, you do have a lock here, which you can lock it in place. So right now it's locked in the A position, which allows the camera to operate the aperture, which is how I usually keep it. But if you unlock it, you can manually change the aperture on here, and you can also declick it. So if you turn this from click to on to off, then when you change the aperture, you can smoothly change the aperture. So generally, as I said, I leave this on the A so the camera controls it, and I lock that in. So a few more features on the Sony lens, but in terms of the overall differences, I would say other than the features, the Sony is a little bit lighter, a tad bit shorter, but I do like the build quality better on the Sigma. Lastly, onto pricing, my conclusion and recommendations. Both of these lenses are very technically solid. They're both very clean. They're very versatile. They get out of the way and allow you to get your work done. These lenses don't have a lot of character and overall look very similar in a lot of situations. But in terms of the cost, there's a huge difference. As you probably know, the Sigma currently is selling for $1,100 in the United States, and the G Master Mark II is going for $2,300. That's a huge difference. That's over double. That's a $1,200 difference. And that money could be used for other things like lighting, audio, another lens, maybe a better camera body. So it's something for you to definitely consider. Very simply, for probably 95% of the people out there, I would recommend the Sigma lens just because it is so much cheaper and you can use that money for other things. It is so close to the Sony in terms of image quality for way less money. So all the little stuff that I showed throughout this video, I don't think you notice that stuff on a day-to-day basis other than, of course, the weight, but is that worth $1,200? That's for you to decide. Now, every lens has a look to it, and I have to say that because these lenses are very clean, they have a very similar look to each other than the color cast, which I mentioned that the Sigma is a little bit warmer, but that can easily be color corrected. Now, how about if you already own the G Master Mark II? Should you sell it and pick up the Sigma now that you know that they are so similar and you can take that money and either save it or put it towards something else? This is a really tough call. For me personally, after going through this test and looking at these two lenses, I'm probably gonna stick with the Sony lens because I already own it. But the other reason for that is that I use this lens for work and I shoot a lot of high-end real estate stuff with this and I make money with this lens. And for me, I wanna have the best possible image quality and the lightest option out there. The difference in money isn't as much for me as I'm mainly using one lens for that work and I do make money with it. So, although if I didn't already own the Sony and I was looking at both, I probably would buy the Sigma, but as I said, it's a really tough call. Overall, really impressed with the Sigma, and now that the Sony definitely seems like a little bit less of an obvious buy to me. So hopefully you found this video helpful. There are links down in the description for these lenses if you want to pick one up. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Please hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.